From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley, and I'm here with journalist and host of Stranger Becomes Neighbor, Andrea Smardon. Andrea, let's start at the beginning. What is Stranger Becomes Neighbor all about?
Well, it's been 2 years since the evacuation of Afghanistan, and I think all of us saw these terrible, desperate images of chaos at the Kabul airport, people desperate to leave the country, families being separated in the crowds, children losing their parents. So I think there was a huge desire on the part of a lot of Americans to help these new arrivals. They were coming to our doorstep. So there was a lot of attention at that time. And what I wanted to do with this podcast is follow it from there. You know, the story doesn't end when they get to America. That's where my story begins with this podcast. So, you know, I think in the beginning there was a lot of attention. There were news stories about what communities were doing to help, but then it fades, right? So I think we committed as America to help these Afghan allies. And my question was, how did we deliver on that promise?
I remember watching that news coverage, but in the cycle of news, it gets turned over so fast. And I think I'm guilty of this. I remember that event. I remember the horror of the attack at the airport. And then a couple of days go by, new stories crop up, focus shifts away. So for somebody who maybe has that same experience, they remember those stories and maybe even thought about this at the time. What happens to these people? Now, a couple of years have gone by. If they start listening to Stranger Becomes Neighbor, what can they expect to hear?
Well, we start back at the beginning when they started to arrive in our communities, and we see the sort of immediate struggles. And at that point, it's kind of an emergency situation. There's an influx of people. It's really a very challenging situation, unprecedented situation in some ways. It was the most number of evacuees, wartime evacuees, than we had seen since the fall of Saigon. So it was more than 80,000 people arriving in the U.S. And the resettlement agencies at this point had been cut back to almost nothing during the Trump years. Trump had greatly reduced the number of refugees allowed into the country. So the refugee agencies, who would normally be in charge of resettling these folks, had to rebuild. And they were only in the beginning of that process of rebuilding when this influx came. So in the beginning, we see this emergency situation. And the question is, if the resettlement agencies can't meet all these needs, who's going to fill in the gaps? So really what I focused on in this podcast wasn't so much the work of the organizations and the government, but more, what do the regular folks, the neighbors in the community, what do they do to fill in the gaps?
I mean, so people like you and me, right?
Yeah, people like you and me. But what I found was they ended up being, the people that I followed were remarkable. I mean, they're regular folks, they're stay-at-home moms. One of the women that I followed was a former refugee herself from Afghanistan. She had been here for 20 years. She had sort of made a success of herself, but now wanted to be able to provide for these new arrivals the way people had helped her when she first arrived. So they are regular people, but as I followed them, I was just in awe sometimes of what I saw of people and the way that they gave of themselves. And so there's this mix, right? And in some cases, you see most of the public is not paying attention anymore. But then there are these committed individuals who are spending, their lunch hour, their evenings, their weekends, all the spare time they have. And in some cases, I would meet volunteers who would help. At some points, they were helping like 40 families. And These are just regular people. They're not resettlement workers. They have lives, they have kids, they have jobs, and they've decided that they care.
What about with the refugees? And I almost hate to use that designator, that name, because in a way, for me, when I say refugee, my brain goes to a place where I picture, some poor, hungry, ill-clothed, maybe and it's just the biases that we carry, right? At the end of the day, they're also average people just from their own country, their own culture. What did you find about the people that you met and their experiences? Did it challenge your perception at all?
Well, I think it's a really good question, because I think especially with this situation with Afghanistan, most of them aren't your typical refugees. Many of them did work with the U.S. military. A lot of them were hoping to obtain a special immigrant visa, which is a special visa just for people that work with the U.S. military as interpreters or supported the U.S. government. So, and when they came in such a hurry, they didn't have the same kind of paperwork that a refugee would have. By the time a refugee is placed in this country, they've already been approved for asylum. Most of these Afghans were not approved for asylum by the time they came, so they were designated as humanitarian parolees. So even using the word refugee isn't quite accurate, because they don't yet have asylum to be refugees. But I think the fact that they are allies, that we were engaged in a 20-year war in Afghanistan, and many of these folks were involved in that effort, changes things. And it also changes their expectations. I think a lot of those who served with the U.S. military expected to be taken care of here, or at least to have a status in the country where they felt secure, where they felt like they had a place.
There was perhaps a promise, whether explicit or implicit, to these people that the time that they spent working with Americans in their own country in Afghanistan, that they would be taken care of and protected. And now the question that you are working on is, okay, they've evacuated, they're here. Are we fulfilling that promise? Do you feel like somebody who listens to Stranger Becomes Neighbor will, in the end, come away feeling like they get an answer to that question? Are we living up to the promise?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I don't give you the answer in the podcast, but I'm giving you the experiences of the people that I follow. So you're following these Afghan evacuees through their struggles. You're following the people who are trying to help them. And so in the end, I guess I leave it to your determination. But I am giving you a very detailed picture, and I'm following people over almost 2 years. So I feel like I'm uncovering a lot, but I also don't want to give away the answers. I feel like that's up to people to decide for themselves.
You mentioned the investment for all of these volunteers that have spent so much of their own personal time, effort, money, helping these Afghans. 2 years of your time reporting this story is also a significant investment. You've worked on this a long time. Are you excited for people to hear? Are you nervous?
Both. But it is really exciting because I have uncovered such amazing stories. So I can't wait for people to hear that part of it. And I think this goes back to, we've been involved in Afghanistan. This was a 20-year war. And I feel like as Americans, we have so little idea what actually went on there. And so this is a chance in some ways to start, this is our way in, right? In some ways. For me, it was, as I was talking to people, I met a woman who served in a special, served with U.S. Special Forces in an elite unit. So she was trained to work with the American military, and it was they had to keep it a secret while it was happening because it was so dangerous for women to be working with American people, especially American men. It just went against everything, all the cultural expectations for women in Afghanistan. And they had to even keep it a secret from their neighbors what they were doing for work, because it could have been dangerous for them if their neighbors found out and told someone, like the Taliban. So it's been fascinating to learn these things. I learned about the National Strike Units, which is Afghan military units who were basically anti-terrorism units. They called themselves Zero units, who did a lot of the anti-terrorism work in Afghanistan. And so there were so many interesting stories that I uncovered, and it was kind of a way in for me. And it was also a way into sort of caring and understanding about these people to see the Americans develop a relationship with them. So in some ways, the relationship was a way in to start to understand these experiences. Stranger Becomes Neighbor has definitely broadened my understanding of these issues. It's introduced me to some really fascinating people through you, and I'm likewise excited for people to hear it. Stranger Becomes Neighbor, Episode 1, is out now. Andrea, where do people find it? You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also find it on our website, strangerbecomesneighbor.com. Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you.